Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for the EHS Now Virtual Summit. My name is Justin Scase, Associate Content Manager at Simplify Compliance, and our next session today is entitled Safety in a Remote Work Environment, sponsored by our friends over at Skillsoft. Before we start today's program, I'd like to go and let you know that you can find all of our housekeeping items in the resource list widget, which will help you familiarize yourself with today's platform. Please also note that the link to your next session, Preserving Your Company's Brand, Your Business During a Pandemic, is in this resource widget as well as some other great resources that are provided to you today by this session's sponsor, Skillsoft. If you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help widget, which has a question mark icon and covers some common technical errors. If your technical issue does not resolve, please enter a question into the Q&A widget, and our team will gladly assist you. And speaking of that Q&A widget, we will also, time permitting, be hosting a live Q&A session at the end of today's event. So I hope you all came with questions, and you can submit them by using that same widget. So let's go ahead and move ahead with today's program, and please join me in welcoming our guest, Donna McEntee, Director of Product Marketing for ESH at Skillsoft. Donna manages Skillsoft's global library of more than 800 workplace environmental health and safety courses, and as the Workplace Safety and Health Solution Director, she works with Skillsoft stakeholders and customers to design effective compliance training programs. With more than 25 years of experience in adult learning and education, she provides subject matter support for workplace safety, health, environmental, and transportation regulations and best practices. Donna holds a master's degree in Safety, Security, and Emergency Management from Eastern Kentucky University and the Graduate Safety Practitioner, GSP, designation from the Board of Certified Safety Professionals. Donna, welcome. Thank you for being here today, and I will now turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Justin. I appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy day to join us for our webinar today. In the wake of the global pandemic and shifting employer and employee work arrangements, more employees than ever are being told to work from home or given that as an option. Injuries can occur at home just like they do in the workplace. As a result of these new work environments, I thought it would be helpful to explore OSHA's regulatory perspective for home office and remote workplaces. We're also going to look at employer liability and risk using a few examples, and identify and reduce ergonomic hazards in a home office environment. We also want to look at hazards and how we can prevent accidents in a home workspace. And then I want to ensure that your organization's EHS policies are clearly communicated, understood, and implemented consistently among your employees. And finally, I want to look at identifying safety training requirements and tracking participation. Okay, let's get started. Every year, thousands of Americans are involved in on-the-job accidents, some fatal, others resulting in lifelong adverse effects. So companies must enable their employees to work safely. With many employees spending their workdays in office environments, that means office safety is a big concern. From an ergonomics perspective, we are 7 months into sitting on our couches, at the kitchen table, or using any available work location in our homes for remote work, using our laptops, tablets, and smartphones to complete our daily tasks. Our shoulders are stiff, our neck and our wrists are sore. I think most of us thought that these would be our temporary working conditions, a few months most. But many employees may not go back to offices or work locations anytime soon and may continue working from home offices or a combination of home office and in-office locations. Over the years, OSHA has offered differing guidance regarding telework, and I use that in quotes because that was the original terminology that OSHA used, or remote work employees. In a 2009 interpretation, they shared that injuries and illnesses that occur while an employee is working at home, including work in a home office, should be considered work-related if the injury or illness occurs while the employee is performing work for pay or compensation at home. The example by OSHA was if an employee drops a box of work documents and injures their foot, the case is considered work-related. If an employee is injured because they trip on the family dog while rushing to answer a work phone call, the case would not be considered work-related. If an employee working at home is electrocuted because of faulty home wiring, the injury is not considered work-related. Before the 2009 interpretation, OSHA shared another interpretation in 1999. And this was, the interpretation number was 1999-11-15. The November 1999 CSC Finances interpretation letter, however, caused widespread confusion and unintended consequences for others. So as a result, OSHA withdrew the letter in January 2000. But I think it's important to share some of the general information from that 1999 interpretation. OSHA was asked what the employer's obligation was with a remote work environment. The example used was a company placing sales executives in home office environments in a single room with a desk, a chair, a file cabinet, a business telephone, desktop or laptop computer, a printer, and a fax machine. Remember, this was 1999, and the home office environments were a bit different than they are today. In OSHA's response, they share that the OSHA Act applies to work performed by an employee in any workplace within the United States, including a workplace located in the employee's home. All employees, including those who entered into a work-at-home agreement, are responsible for complying with the OSHA Act and safety and health standards. Even though the workplace is a designated area in the employee's home, the employer retains some degree of control over the conditions of the work environment agreement. An important factor in developing these arrangements is to ensure that employees are not exposed to reasonably foreseeable hazards created by their at-home employment. Ensuring safe and healthy working conditions for the employee should be a precondition of any home-based work assignments. In this interpretation, OSHA directed that employers should exercise reasonable diligence to identify in advance the possible hazards associated with particular remote work assignments and should provide the necessary protection through training, personal protective equipment, or other controls appropriate to reduce and eliminate the hazard. Where the employer provides work materials for use in the employee's home, the employer should ensure that the employer-provided tools or supplies pose no hazard under reasonably foreseeable conditions of storage or use by employees. They also said that an employer must take appropriate steps when the employer knows or has a reason to know that the employee-provided tools or supplies would create a safety or health risk. At the time, OSHA shared that the employer is responsible for ensuring that employees have a safe and healthy workplace, not a safe and healthy home. The employer is responsible only for preventing and correcting hazards to which the employee may be exposed for their work. For example, if work is performed in the basement of a residence and the stairs leading to the space are unsafe, the employer could be liable if the employer knows or reasonably should have known the dangerous condition. There's no general requirement in OSHA standards or regulations that employers routinely conduct safety inspections of all work locations, which would include home offices. However, there are certain standards that require periodic inspection of specific kinds of equipment in work operations, such as ladders, compressed gas cylinders, electrical protective equipment, as an example. Although some of these operations are probably not found in most home-based workplaces, if an employer of a home-based employee is aware of safety or health hazards or has a reason to be aware, then the OSHA Act requires the employer to pursue all feasible steps to protect employees. So you can imagine from this interpretation that last statement caused significant concern for both employers and employees. The letter addressed only the employer's responsibilities under the OSHA Act, and depending on what kind of business the at-home employer is engaged in, they may have additional responsibilities under other laws as well as under state regulations and health, licensing, zoning, fire, building codes, and other matters. Again, this interpretation letter caused widespread confusion and unintended consequences. So in January of 2000, the result of these unintended consequences, OSHA withdrew that letter. So where do we stand today? In 2000, OSHA added to the Compliance Directive, CPLs, definitions for a home-based work site and an office. The work site is an area in the employee's residence where the employee performs work for the employer. And the home office is office work activities in a home-based work site. And it goes on to provide a detailed description of that, and activities such as, were conducted in an office environment using office equipment. Additionally, at that time, they shared that the Department of Labor strongly supports telecommuting and telework. Family-friendly, flexible, and fair work arrangements can benefit individual employees and their families and the society as a whole. As we know, the purpose of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, the OSHA Act, is to ensure as far as possible every working man and woman in the nation safe and healthful working conditions. So I think it's fair to say that OSHA respects the privacy of the home and, to my knowledge, has never conducted inspections of home offices. Okay, let's do a quick poll. As an employer, do you feel like you have little or no control over employees' home office environment? And if you can just record your response at this time. I'm curious to see sort of where everybody is on the spectrum. I think the consensus at this point is you do feel like you have little or no control over the employee's home office environment. And that's not surprising at this time. So let's look at your liability and responsibilities. As a safety professional, you are concerned about workplace safety, and you may feel like you have little or no control over the employee's home office and remote work environment. Employees also have increased challenges and risks working from home. If injured, it may be difficult to prove that an injury was work-related because there's usually less evidence available in these home office scenarios, and remote work employees often are all by themselves while they work. So if an injury occurs, there's often no one present to corroborate the accident or determine what happened. If we look at this from a legal perspective, as a general rule, when an employee deviates from performing a job for personal benefit, then the injury that occurred at work is usually not considered within the course and scope of employment and therefore would not be covered from a liability standpoint. Once the employee returns to the workplace, to their course of employment, then an injury that occurs after that point would be covered. So is a trip and fall while walking to the refrigerator for lunch when the employee is working at home considered in the course and scope of employment? Let's look at a couple of liability cases that explore different work-at-home scenarios. In the first example, Verizon Pennsylvania and Workers' Compensation Appeal Board, an employee was working remotely at home when she fell down the stairs to her home office and injured her neck. She was working from her basement and left the basement to go upstairs to the kitchen to get a drink. She returned in a hurry to answer a ringing telephone and then fell down the stairs in the process. She filed a claim insisting that she was furthering the employer's business interests at that time, meaning she was trying to answer the ringing phone, but was doing so while returning from getting a drink. The employer argued that she was not in the course and scope because she had gone upstairs to get a drink. In this case, the court determined that the employee was working at her home office, a fixed location approved by the employer as her secondary work premises. The employer had argued that she had left her work location, but the court disagreed and confirmed that she was working. Alternately, in another case, Collins v. Workman's Comp, a worker was injured when she fell in a hole in the sidewalk while on a lunch break 2 blocks from her work location. She was obviously not working at the time. Her injury was on her lunch break and was therefore considered not compensable. In another example, in Sedgwick CMS versus Valcourt Williams, an employee tripped over her dog during working hours while reaching for a coffee cup in the kitchen, and then as a result, filed a workers' compensation claim. The judge determined the injury was compensable, concluding that the work-from-home arrangement meant the employer, and this is a bit of a legal statement, imported the work environment into the claimant's home and the claimant's home into the work environment. The decision was appealed, and the court said that the relevant risk was that the employee might trip over her dog while reaching for a coffee cup while working in her kitchen. The risk exists whether the employee is at home working or whether she is at home not working. It existed before she took the job, and it'll exist after her employment ends, as long as she maintains a home with a dog. Because the risk did not arise out of employment, the court determined that her injury was not in the course and scope of her employment. And in another instance, there's a case from Martinez v. State Office of Risk Management. A Texas caseworker was injured while working at home on a Saturday. She was sitting at her kitchen table when she decided to retrieve a different pen from the other side of her kitchen. She tripped and fell, breaking her shoulder and hitting her head. Her claim was denied because she violated her agency's policy by working from home without prior approval, and because she had no prior authorization. The injury was not compensable. As you can see from these various cases, it's very complex to determine whether workplace injuries are in the course of work or not. So are home offices dangerous? In a recent Forbes article, Laurel Farrer shared that while employees regularly receive occupational safety training, most office workers have no idea how many hundreds of hours and millions of dollars have been invested into making their office environments safe and compliant. As employers, you have invested significant time and resources in selecting desks, monitors, adjustable chairs, task lighting, and light bulbs, ensuring that electrical outlets support the devices that are being used. Now, as employees have moved from their office locations to home offices, the employees have become responsible for their office designs. Have the employees given any thought to their workstations, or are they sitting on the floor, couches, or at the kitchen table? Or are they more concerned about how their office looks on a Zoom meeting than whether their monitor is at a correct height or their chair is adjustable to prevent backaches? As we've discussed, OSHA won't hold employers liable for employees' home offices and does not expect employers to inspect the home offices of their employees. However, there are steps you can take to protect employees working from home. Let's complete another poll and respond to 2 questions. The first is, have you conducted home office ergonomics assessments? And if you can take just a minute and answer that question first. Okay. So looking at the poll results, the majority of you have not conducted home office ergonomics assessments. Let's go ahead and take a look at another question. Have you conducted home office hazard assessments? You can take just a second and respond to this question. Again, not very surprising, the majority of you have not conducted home office hazard assessments. So let's look at home office ergonomics first. Why should we care about office safety and computer ergonomics? Even though musculoskeletal diseases tend to be gradual or chronic injuries, it's essential to work safely every day to prevent the development of these types of injuries. While there are no federal standards for ergonomics, OSHA has covered ergonomics in the workplace under Section 5A1, the General Duty Clause, which requires employers to provide a work environment free from recognized hazards. Developing a program to keep your employees healthy, productive, and motivated while making their working life as enjoyable as possible is really the right thing to do. You can express your commitment to your employees in a variety of ways. For example, you could hold virtual meetings to discuss the ergonomic issues that they face at home and set specific ergonomic goals and priorities that are achievable and in line with your productivity and quality initiatives. It's important for employees to recognize the signs and symptoms of musculoskeletal disorders. One thing you can do is encourage employees to take frequent breaks. One thought is every 30 minutes is a good guideline and helps employees remain healthy and minimize injuries to the back, shoulders, and arms. It's not healthy for them to do all sitting or all standing all the time. So you may want to encourage your employees to alter positions and change their work location throughout the day. If your employees have the equipment at home that they need, did you allow them to bring their monitors, their chairs, or other needed office equipment to the home when they transition? It's important to recognize that the laptops that they use were originally designed to be used in short-term applications, typically while traveling. And now they're using these laptops 8 hours a day or more. Even when sitting at a kitchen table, the monitors and keyboards on the laptops are not at the correct heights. The keyboards are smaller than the keyboards that they're used to using with an office computer. So one thing you can do is consider conducting ergonomics assessments of employees working at home. One option would be to simply survey employees. The ASSP has shared some questions on their website that would be good to ask, such as, are you working from your home kitchen table, couch, or desk? What about your phone? Do your employees have headsets for long conversations or virtual meetings? Can they use a speakerphone, or is there too much background noise? Maybe they've been sitting for long periods of time and not taking frequent breaks. Ask them how they feel. Is their neck stiff? Does their back hurt? How about their hands and wrists? Are their eyes tired? Are they using awkward postures or uncomfortable desk configurations? Maybe they have inadequate lighting. All of these can lead to long-term chronic musculoskeletal disorders. OSHA also provides a checklist that could be adapted and used to assess your employee workspaces, and that's found under the e-tools section on OSHA's website. And as a follow-up to this meeting, Skillsoft will also be sharing with you an ergonomics assessment form that you can use to conduct ergonomics assessments. So sending out a survey is one option. In one study that was conducted by the University of Cincinnati, an ergonomic evaluation of home workstations identified many issues affecting workers. Specifically, what they noted was chairs were at the wrong height, and about 41% of the respondents, the chairs were too low, and 2% were too high. 53% of workers had armrests on their chairs, and only 30% did not use them. And for 18% of the workers, the armrests were improperly adjusted, the study found. So even when providing equipment for employees, it's important to ensure that it's being used correctly. Chairs with adjustable armrests can reduce the contact stress on the arms when they're resting on hard surfaces such as tables. Chairs can also provide support for backs, maintaining the correct lumbar curvature and reducing backaches. Laptop monitors are typically too low to be correctly positioned, External monitors could be provided and adjusted to the employee's eye height, reducing neck pain and awkward postures. And not all adjustments that you provide need to be expensive. Employees may use pillows to raise their seat height, or they can use rolled up towel to provide lumbar support. Rolled up towels could also be used to raise chair height on the arms. And if an external monitor is being used, they can raise it by placing on objects such as books or small boxes. The same is true for a laptop. If you are encouraging alternate work positions, such as sitting part of the day and standing, you can use objects around the house to make alternate workstations. For example, changing from a kitchen table to an elevated kitchen bar or an elevated countertop. That would be one way to switch from a sitting position to a standing position. Employees could use a large box or maybe even a laundry basket flipped over to rest their laptop on, switch to a standing workstation. So there are many objects around the home that could be used to alter the workstations and accommodate the employees and make them more comfortable from an ergonomic standpoint. But really the first step is to conduct the assessment and ensure that the employees have the right equipment for their work environment. Okay, let's look at some other hazards. What other hazards might exist in a remote work environment? An employer is responsible for correcting hazards which they know about. For example, if you provide office equipment such as computers, printers, scanners in an employee's home. And if it's, from a fire safety perspective, would the use of this equipment overload the employee's home electrical circuits? One suggestion would be to train employees on the basis of conducting a job hazard analysis and then provide guidance for eliminating those hazards where identified if possible. So we know that there are basic steps for conducting a hazard analysis, such as breaking the employee's jobs down into steps, identifying the hazards for each step, and evaluating those. And then this is where you can work with the employee to recommend any safety changes, procedures, and protections, and then periodically review and update these with the employee. It would be good to use a form to conduct the hazard analysis, and this could be deployed electronically and completed by employees and then reviewed by your organization. OSHA has a simple form for conducting a job hazard analysis that's available at OSHA.gov in the publications section. And once the analysis is complete, you can then work with employees to implement the hierarchy of controls that would be appropriate, such as eliminating of the hazard, substitution of material hazard with a non-hazardous object, for example. Are there engineering controls that could be implemented? Looking at administrative controls such as, changing your work location through the day to alleviate any ergonomic stress. And then, if needed, providing personal protective equipment. Hazards to be considered in the home would include things such as fire safety, emergency plans. You may also want to look at appropriate lighting, cooling, heating, and ventilation. Is the employee working in a comfortable environment? And then from a materials perspective, is the employee's home location safe? Is there asbestos present? Is there lead, such as old paint? Do they have chemicals or toxic materials within the home itself? And would these need to be addressed via a safety data sheet? If an employee is performing work for the employer that involves exposure to any chemical substance, a safety data sheet would be required. And that would need to be kept at the home work site. It's unlikely that a home office employee would need to deal with lockout tagout at the home, but if a remote employee is performing servicing and maintenance on machines and equipment, then the lockout tagout standard applies, and the employee would need to have appropriate training and direction for those types of activities. When thinking about building and fire codes, typically from an office perspective, you need to have 2 entrances and exits. But from a home office perspective, that's not always going to be the case. So, use, common sense around that one. One option might be to ensure that employees are aware of what to do in case of a fire. Encourage them to create an emergency plan for their home, for instance, or to do a survey of their home. And are there fire hazards, such as stacks of papers, boxes, those types of things that should be cleaned up before they cause an issue in the home office. And then personal protective equipment. It's unlikely that your employees would need PPE in a home office, but if there are hazards, the employer is required to assess the workplace to determine if hazards necessitate the use of PPE. And then, as always, the employees must be trained in the proper use and maintenance of that personal protective equipment, and the employer must verify through written documentation that each affected employee has received and understood the required training. So in addition to evaluating the hazards, what training would be required for that once that analysis is conducted? And one thing that you can do is to determine what type of training should be provided based on the hazards that were analyzed, and provide training on that particular hazard. It's not always necessary for training to be written, but it's a good idea to provide it and document that the employee has received training. And that could be done electronically, through an online learning management system, as an example. Next would be ensure that ES&H policies are clearly communicated. So once you've moved employees to a homework environment, are you going to develop any policies or procedures related to that? And part of that might be, the first thing you need to do is conduct a hazard analysis. Maybe the next thing would be an ergonomics assessment. And that type of information, can be done via surveys or electronically, and have the employees get that information and provide it back to you for review. Document that those have been conducted, along with any additional policies that you want to create to protect your employees. Involvement of the employees is key. You want to ensure that the fullest protection is provided to your employees in the workplace, and properly identify and assess the nature of existing hazards. In the case of home-based work sites, employees should be involved only where they freely consented to the provision of assistance provided by the employer, and then only with written parameters. So as an example, if you're doing an ergonomics assessment, you may ask the employee to provide you a picture of their workplace, but only do that if they have provided permission for you to review that image as a part of the ergonomics assessment. So dispersing information. There are a number of online tools that could be used for policy certification, such as when you do develop policies, to send those out, distribute those, and ask for affirmation or attestation that the employees have reviewed and agreed to any policies that you've created. If you have any scored examinations, if you're going to, for example, do an ergonomics training program and have the employees complete an assessment, you might want to document the completion of that exam. You can also use online tools to distribute questionnaires and checklists, and that's a great way just to stay in contact with your employees that are working remotely. You can also use surveys, just general questioning of your employee population. One example might be a mental health survey. What we're finding now as COVID continues and employees are at home much longer periods of time, it has been very stressful on employees. So you may want to do a wellness check and just see if employees are having any issues. Is there anything that you can do from the employer perspective to make their working environment more accommodating, or just from a mental health perspective, make sure that your employees are doing okay. And then you can also distribute custom training materials through online systems to be able to document that information as well. Okay, and that is all I had on the topic right now. Justin, I wanted to see if you've received any questions that we could take a look at.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Donna. We do have quite a few questions in our queue right now. So we'll start with some of the basic ones. The first question here is, how would you assess home office hazards?
Sure. I think going back to the job hazard analysis, OSHA has a form that you could use and maybe even modify a bit for an employee to complete. And I think I would look at it, from a perspective of an ergonomic assessment as well as other hazards in the workplace. Looking at fire hazards, do they have a fire extinguisher if needed? Smoke alarms, do they have working smoke alarms? Electrical, do they feel like their home office environment supports the electrical needs for the equipment that they're using? So looking at typical hazards in the home office, including those as part of the hazard assessment to find out, is there anything from an employer perspective you can do to help ensure that their home workspace is safe?
All right, great, thank you. The next question that we have here is, what training would you recommend for home office employees?
A lot of that depend on the hazards that you identify. So, if employees are working at home, an ergonomics perspective, I think I would definitely provide training around ergonomics, at a minimum computer ergonomics. General ergonomics training would be good as well, encouraging them to, stretch frequently, ensure that their workstations are set up, take breaks. From a computer ergonomics, making sure that their keyboard is at the correct height, make sure they understand how to do a correct setup of that equipment, and recognize signs and symptoms of musculoskeletal disorders, aches and pains and stiffness and those sorts of things. I think all of that would be important. Along with that, I think fire safety, just in general, is a good one. And slips, trips, and falls. You saw from some of the examples I shared, common injuries at home are slips and trips. And employees may not think about that from a hazard perspective when they're working from home, but they're very common. Tripping over cords, maybe they've plugged in their laptop and stretched it across the kitchen, and then they trip over the cord while going to get a cup of coffee, that sort of thing. So focus on those very common injuries, and then training just to reinforce with with your employees, what those hazards are and how they can minimize those in their home office environment.
Great, thank you. We have another question here about assessments of hazards. May these assessments be done as self-assessments by the home workers? With COVID-19, I'm reluctant to have someone go into our employees' homes.
Definitely. I think the way I would structure them is, train the employees on how to conduct the assessments and the tools that you are going to provide, and then have them conduct the assessments, and then set up a time, to review those assessments with the employees virtually. There's all kinds of tools available, Zoom, team meetings, that sort of thing. And I think it could be done very effectively from a virtual perspective. Again, being respectful of the employee's workspace and not, wanting to invade their privacy as well. But I think that's definitely a great approach to it.
All right, great. Now we have another question here. If the employer allows chairs, keyboards, sit-stand stations, desks to be taken home, is the employer responsible for any injuries that may be incurred transporting these items from the office to the home?
That's definitely a question for an attorney. I would think yes, because they're moving that equipment in the course of their employment. So I think there's definitely some liability or risk in the transfer of the equipment. So you may want to have some conversations with the employees about how to do that safely.
Okay, great, thank you. There's one question here about when you mentioned lead and asbestos. If an employer is allowing an employee to work from home, how does an employer know that these exposures happen, and how can they be responsible for the presence of such things in the home?
Yeah, I think that goes back to the employer. I forget what the specific statement was from OSHA, but the employer has to have an awareness of that hazard. So that would be a conversation with the employee around, do you want to do an assessment like that? The employee may or may not know if they have asbestos in the home, but if you as an employer are aware that they do, you may want to, make some recommendations around that, or make the employee aware of what the hazards are. I think that's, a pretty low risk at this day and time, but, asbestos is still in, a lot of homes.
Great, thank you. Now, somewhat, it's a different hazard, but somewhat related to hazards that may be outside of the employer's control. Would exposure to wildfire smoke be part of the home office hazard assessment?
That's a great question, and we've been looking at it recently because of California and Oregon and some of the other wildfires. We are looking at whether that should be included as part of the training. Skillsoft does have a course on respiratory protection for California that discusses wildfire smoke, but not specifically for home office workers. So I don't have a definitive statement on that yet. I think in that situation you should probably reach out to your regional OSHA agency and get some additional clarification on it, because it's definitely a known hazard at this point. But how would you treat from an employer perspective? And I don't have the guidance on that right now.
Okay, great, thank you. We have one question here regarding the SDS requirements, the safety data sheet requirements that you briefly mentioned before. Are these for work-related chemicals or any home chemical, as these folks are working from home?
These would be for any work-related chemicals. So if you have an employee working remotely with chemicals provided for their work, you should also provide the SDS for those chemicals they're using. It would not extend to any employees, like everyday cleaning materials that they use in their homes. It would only be if it's work-related.
Right, great, thank you. Now, there are several questions here that are somewhat related, so I'm going to ask them sort of all at the same time here. They're asking about, do you have, you mentioned this briefly before, is there a home office inspection or hazard analysis checklist that you can share? Do you have examples of a mental health survey or wellness check? And do you have examples of home office ergonomics assessments that can be shared with our audience?
Sure. We are going to be sharing a ergonomics assessment checklist after the webinar, so you'll receive a copy of that from us as well. Mental health, let me check on that. I think I do have an assessment or a checklist on that. If we do, I'll flag that to send out to everyone as well.
Wonderful.
It's
Thanks
a part.
very
I think
much.
we have yeah. Oh yeah, perfect. Thanks.
Okay, great. Let's see. We have one of our attendees is asking Donna if you could please review again the current OSHA interpretation of the employer's responsibility in a remote environment.
Okay. So really, the only current one, let me go to that place in my notes. Give me just a second. So really, the only one that's currently active is the one from 2009, 3/30/2009, and it talked about telework. And it was just a simple question, if they had a couple of examples. An employee drops a box of work documents and injures their foot, the case is considered work-related. So OSHA had given just a few examples and a response to that. To the best of my knowledge, that is the only current home office interpretation that is currently in place. The only other thing that they had added was in 2000 to the compliance inspection manual was the definition of home-based worksite and home office. That was CPL 02-00125. So those are the only ones that are in place at this point. The 1999 version had been removed in January 2000 because of all the confusion that it caused.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We still have a whole bunch of questions here. Once you identify hazards, even at the home, one of our attendees would like to know, is the employer responsible for purchasing sitting or standing desks, keyboards, chairs, etc. for the employees for ergonomics protection, even if you don't identify the hazards? What's the employer's responsibility for providing these materials?
I don't think it has to be, purchasing sit stand, keyboards, chairs, unless that's the only option to make a workspace comfortable for an employee. I think as part of doing an ergonomics assessment, you identify, does the employee in their office have a place that they can work, and providing suggestions on adjustments. A couple of examples I gave is you don't have to have a sit-stand desk. You can use a box, a higher level countertop, things like that to adjust the workstation. So I think you can give them, some suggestions and adjustments. But if an employee, does have ergonomic issues, musculoskeletal disorders, based on the way that they're working, you may have to make some additional adjustments, and it may include purchasing equipment in that case. But I think you probably try the other options first, and make sure they understand, how to use their equipment safely. I wonder just, how many people on this call have sort of sat up a little bit straighter or, moved their desk or their laptop as we've been talking about some of these ergonomic issues. Sometimes it's just a situation where you need to make them aware of why they have neck pain or wrist pain or back pain and things that they can do.
Yes, absolutely. Great, thank you for that. Let me see if I am reading this question correctly. Does OSHA have limits on the type of equipment that can be used in a home office? For instance, they mentioned such equipment as non-chemical benchtop lab equipment. Is it allowable for employees to use this equipment at home, or does OSHA have a limit on what can be moved into a home work environment?
I don't believe they do, and actually I had sort of pared down a couple of the interpretations since we were specifically speaking to home office work environments and not manufacturing or, some other, clarification they gave was around sewing or assembly, electronics assembly at home. So to the best of knowledge, there are no limitations, and if you have different and unique work environments for those home office or home remote work employees, you may want to look at that as well, especially in terms of some of the other hazards I mentioned, like electricity, powered equipment, if they're doing welding or, any other type of hazardous type of work that requires inspections, as part of the work being done. So you may want to take a little bit broader look at it versus, what we've discussed today from a home office environment.
All right, great, thank you. Now we have another question here. This sounds like they are asking if you request photographs from employees, pictures, in order to assess a home environment for hazards. If you don't receive a picture after this request, would this be considered an employee's tacit approval without written approval of acknowledgement of a hazard?
I'm not 100% sure about the question. I think if I can just restate it, if you are doing an ergonomics assessment, as part of that, if you've asked an employee to provide an image of, their workstation and how they're going to work, I think you would want to get written approval as a part of that. So, a little verification statement. As part of this assessment, as the employee, I'm agreeing to provide you, with this image. That something along those lines. I think I would work with maybe your HR team or maybe even legal counsel to figure out how you would want to word that, so that you're very clear that the scope of this is only to do an ergonomics assessment, if that's the assessment that you're doing. I don't know if that was helpful or not. If you have an additional question, let me know.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. We have one question here from earlier in your presentation when you were referring to court cases. One of our attendees would like to know, what was the result of the Schwann Food versus Frederick slipped on the ice case?
Oh, yeah. Schwann Food, it was actually considered work-related because his workday began, apparently, the way his agreement was written, he was a work-from-home employee, and his workday began at the time he left his home to start making deliveries. So it was considered work-related, whereas the other one wasn't because the employee was on her lunch break. So.
All right, wonderful. Now we are approaching the top of the hour, and we have moved through all of the questions that we have regarding your presentation. Oh wait, it looks like, let's see here. So thank you very much, Donna, for being with us today. Do you have anything that you would like to share with our audience before we wrap up and perhaps give them 5 minutes or so before the start of their next session of EHS Now?
Yeah, just thank you guys for your participation today. I've really enjoyed the topic, and I hope it was helpful for you as well. Look forward to maybe working with some of you guys in the future. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks.
All right, great. I would like to once again thank Donna for being here with us today, and for Skillsoft for sponsoring today's session, and to all of our attendees for joining us. Be sure to check out the resource list widget for a link to our next session, Preserving Your Company's Brand, Your Business During a Pandemic, sponsored by Intellex, and that will be starting in a little more than 5 minutes. We recommend opening that up now and having it ready for you to hop right in at 1 p.m. Eastern. Thanks again for joining us today, and this concludes our program.